Grandfather's Sovereigns by author Chrisse Feros. Chapter 1. Kythera, 300 million years ago to 1450 BC. What a setting for our story. Grandfather would have known that his island Kythera had been hit by many calamities. Exactly 100 years after the setting of our story, geologists have given us an understanding of why the island has a special place in the world. We are keen to get to Grandfather's story, but please indulge me in hearing out this brief explanation. The rocks of northern Kythera are a bit of a jumble which geologists call alpine flesh. When you tramp the hills of Midata, you will see granite, gneiss, and quartzite. Not very appealing if you like black soils and lush vegetation. The setting is stupendous and fittingly described as a conflict of the gods. Some 40 million years ago, the heavier and larger African plate started its relentless movement north into and under the lighter Eurasian plate. The unfortunate rocks on the Greek side suffered deformation and morphed into alpine flesh. Prior to this collision, the rocks were quietly and happily being deposited in the ancient Tethys Sea some 300 million years before. This collision of the plates went on to produce the famous European Alps and parts of the Himalayas. Locally in Greece, we have the Pindus Mountains and the legendary Mount Olympus. The plate movement continues to this day, and the African plate is moving 1 to 2 centimeters a year. Pretty slow, but enough to build up enormous pressure. The earthquakes are the result of faults which slip and slide when they can no longer soak up the pressure. Eventually, we won't have a Mediterranean Sea, and Africa and Europe will be fused together in one continent. Don't worry, there's plenty of time for Greece and its idyllic setting, about 50 million years. If earthquakes and crustal movement are not enough to worry about, the region suffered a calamitous event around 1450 BC. The incomparable and much visited island of Santorini is the remnant of a much larger island called Thera. The volcanic island blew up, releasing enormous volumes of lava and pyroclastics. To compound the situation, the caldera collapsed, the seawaters rushed in. The unfortunate result was a second round of eruption, this time lighter volcanic ash, which undoubtedly would have blacked out the globe for a few days, creating a worldwide greenhouse effect. There's more. Unfortunate Crete was downwind to the south and was in the firing line of the ash cloud. Anything else? Sadly, yes. Tsunamis then hit Crete and destroyed lives and reputedly led to the eventual fall of the Minoan civilization in the aftermath. Fortunately, Kythera was well to the west. However, the loss of Crete and demise of the Minoans must have been a devastating blow. There is also no evidence yet of tsunami debris on the Avlemos side of the island, but the discovery of debris on northern Crete was only made by curious geologists in the last few decades. Time will tell. Before we start our story, indulge me in thinking about another group who kept an eye on proceedings. Chapter 2. The Gods Are Watching. The eastern frieze of the Parthenon has a marvelous depiction of the gods. Heracles would have been most pleased with the construction. Another who was most pleased would have been Zeus. Zeus may not have understood plate tectonics, and the real reason that his mountain home of Olympus was a result of the African plate moving north under the Eurasian plate. But he knew everything that happened to the mortals below was for a reason. One thing Zeus did know was that the fabulous wealth of Athens in Pericles' time rested on the silver mines of Lavrion, only 50 kilometers south of Athens. Geologists now tell us that the silver deposits were formed in the Attic Cycladic metamorphics and a product of the plate tectonics. Zeus would also have been chuffed to know that the famous Pentaklikon marble that Pericles used for his construction was also a product of metamorphism and the movement of the plates. Unbelievable that the world's best marble was only some 17 kilometers northeast of Athens. My Italian friends would differ and say, of course, that their Carrara marble is the best. Zeus mused that his mortals below were very lucky. Money and marble. What else would they need to build what was destined to become the world's most iconic building? Well, actually a lot more. And that's why he was fond of his mortals. They were always up for a challenge. Poseidon, however, was very upset. Zeus had to counsel him not to take things too personally. He explained to Poseidon, god of the sea, forces and earthquakes, that his beloved Tethys sea, upset first by the moving plates, then by the implosion of Thera, was all for some good reason. Zeus also reminded him that he had patiently taught Poseidon how to swim at Kavori Beach, and that he also should be patient with the mortals. With the destruction by wars, earthquakes, and looting by foreigners of the Parthenon, Zeus had to calm all the other gods down. One day, he explained, the Parthenon, especially his beloved eastern frieze, would be put back together. Let's get down to the mortals now of our story. First, however, you need to know how any stories were kept in this time. The answer to this is Mantinades. After all, that's the only clue we have as to the story of Grandfather. Chapter 3. Mantinades. Let me hand you to Chrisse for this explanation. Mantinades, the plural of Mantinada, appeared in Greece and in particularly Crete in the 15th century. The word Mantinada is derived from the Venetian language and means morning song, and can be historically tracked back to at least the Renaissance from around the 14th to the 17th century. The use of rhyme, and in particular the use of 15-syllable rhyming couplet flow, is commonly found in the Cretan's verses and is used as a complete delivery. The 15-syllable flow is certainly not a rule, and based upon the very moving and haunting vocal delivery of the Greek and Cretan singers of the Mantinades, we see a very wonderful freestyle form. Musically, a simple explanation of syllabic music is music with a lyric, which is sung mostly with one text syllable per music note. The Mantinades that have deep cultural appeal and heartfelt sensitivity to me are those Mantinades sung as a delivery between two persons with reach out and response. I am frequently in search of the earliest recordings of lament Mantinades, and those Mantinades which have come from the displaced Greeks of Asia Minor, which are my own background families. Great joy, I have found just a handful. So what does the Mantinada verse seek to touch on? What does the lyricist or the author have in mind when the verse is made up on the spot? Maybe an emotional recollection which prompted a poetical song? Maybe the singer is sharing a century-old family story. There are no rules on subject matter. How great is that? The Mantinada lyric touches on every part of humanism and life itself. The lyrics embrace love, falling in love, romance, tales of the heart, hope, anger, the perils of day-to-day life, war, politics, satire, and even the loss of loved ones. In Greece, the accompaniment may usually be simply the lyra, or just delivered vocally without any accompaniment in that moment. Many Mantinada lyrics have been memorized, many now forgotten. Many have been handed down between families, loved ones and friends to be memorized and kept forever. I have composed and written 3 Mantinadas for our readers. One about love, one about loss, and one 15-syllabic political satire verse. The first Mantinada is dedicated to the author of this book, John, my husband, on the subject of love. Your heart is my love, your love is my sun, eyes shine in my life, we walk it as one. On sadness and loss. Such pain in my heart, so hard to breathe. I held on so hard, but you had to leave. On political satire. They do what they want, but what do they see? No life for our trees. John's response. Thank you, Chrisse, an accomplished musician who could no doubt carry on Anastasia's tradition. When you think about it, in its time the Mantinada was a form of social media, poetry written to music and designed to be sung between 2 parties. Nowadays we do this by SMS or email. Times change, do they really? Chapter 4. Mitata, Kythera, 1920. One of the traditions of the Feros family was to visit Avlemonas once a year. It was just down the road from Mitata, and whilst they preferred a year Palagia for its beaches, this was their tradition. As a young boy, grandfather would take the boys aside and show them midden heaps of old shells. He explained, although the boys wouldn't have understood, that these heaps had some old family connection. The middens were old dumps of opened murex shells, part of the mollusk family. Some 2,000 years ago, in the Phoenician and Minoan times, the shells were an important source of purple dyes. The murex shells were crushed, boiled down and reduced to produce a purple powder. This in turn produced not only a brilliant purple dye, but a natural mordant. A mordant retains colour for longer in cloth. The well-to-do and upper classes preferred to dress in the purple tunics to stand out from the common class. The Phoenicians were heavily involved in the trade of dyes, which they called Tyrian purple. Crete was the world's largest producer, but surprisingly Kythera was also an important source. You look at the maps of where the Phoenicians sailed, you could see that Kythera was on the main trading route from west to east. Jumping forward to early Christian times, the Bible tells us of Saint Lydia of Philippi in Greek Macedonia. Saint Luke wrote that she was a Porphyropolis. I repeat that for you, Porphyropolis, a merchant of purple cloth. Saint Paul was preaching in the area of Troy when he dreamt that he was asked by a man to come to Macedonia to help. At the Gagetis River, he found a group praying to the pagan gods. Leading the group in prayer was Saint Lydia. After learning from Paul about Jesus, she was baptized alongside many of her followers. She is regarded as the first Christian of Europe. Now, it is just conjecture that the family name Feros is a derivative of Phyropoulos, and prior to that, Porphyropoulos. Were they once involved in the Tyrian purple trade? No proof, just conjecture. Chapter 5. The Banker. We never heard Mother's Muntinother, and frankly can't speculate on the banker's name. We also won't speculate. It was not that long ago. We do know that he was Greek and was very familiar with the banking system of the early 1920s and maintained offices in New York and Piraeus. He may have had original connections with Gythera. We are not quite sure. Mihaly, our name for the banker, had set up an impressive Greek headquarters in Odos Kolokotroni in Piraeus. This was a 5-story building of Art Deco style with a basement, an elevator, and a rooftop terrace. The ground floor was the customer bank area, and Mihaly made it secure by having a uniformed guard at the street entrance. The ground floor retail staff were always impeccably dressed and ever so polite to customers and visitors. The second and third floors were restricted to high-value clients, and access was by invitation and appointment only. Security was also in place by a second armed uniformed guard at the entrance to the second floor rooms. The fourth and fifth floors were off limits and described as being for internal administration. Mihaly, the banker, had used the same layout in his Astoria headquarters in New York. The ground floor had the trappings of a conventional retail bank, where the good folk of Piraeus made their deposits, took their withdrawals, and sometimes arranged to receive and make overseas transfers. In the 1920s, most of the transfers were incoming in from relatives who had already made the step to migrate to the US and to Australia. Mihaly, then in his early 40s, spoke perfect Greek. He was born in Greece, and spoke English with a New York accent. The story circulated was that he had a degree in accounting from an American university and had cut his teeth first with a major accounting firm and then an international bank. The front of Mihaly's business card read, Mihaly, Chairman, Anglo-American Bank, New York, London and Piraeus, established 1856. The back of the card simply said, in inverted commas, a man you can trust. Don't laugh, I've seen this notation. A man you can trust, more than once. Of course, in those days there were no websites, LinkedIn or Facebook, but there were phones. The card was a calling card popular in the 1920s that you handed to someone so that you could be announced and you could be remembered. Now, in his early 40s, Mihaly was at the top of his game, in his banker's formal suit and always with a white shirt and gold cufflinks. he presented himself as a charming and successful man. Many people would notice his briefcase. This was slightly larger than the normal slim briefcase, more of a valise. What stood out was the tan leather, a golden brown, 2 side straps, a central lock, and monogrammed with his initials. The miniature English and US flags on either side of the central lock rounded out the look of a successful Anglo-American banker. He entertained lavishly and regaled clients and others with impressive stories of well-connected people that he knew on first-name basis. Rather surprisingly, for one so apparently well-connected, he personally made quarterly visits to small Greek islands, one of which, unfortunately for grandfather, was Gythera. Even more unusual, he had a circuit of small villages, and again, unfortunately for grandfather, one of these was Mitata. Michali always travelled alone. He never had an off-sider or bank manager with him on his trips. He did, however, always have his chauffeur, and where possible hired the best car possible. In 1920, the T-model Ford was the most common car, and Michali was anxiously awaiting the new to be released, Daimler-Benz. Grandfather first came across the banker when he was introduced to this rather smartly dressed fellow at the Café Neo. Grandfather was having a string of successful years. His decision to build his own crushing mill meant that the local farmers did not need to take their grain to Potamos. That, combined with his other interest in crops and honey, was building up a good reserve of funds. Whilst the nature of business was barter, gold coins changed hands when it suited the parties. The banker had heard about grandfather from his sources in Kapsali, which was his base for his sales trips to Gythera. He decided to pay him a visit whilst visiting other clients in Potamos and Caravas. Some say that he actually had inside knowledge of grandfather's growing wealth, but we didn't know this for sure. Mother's Mandinather knows, but we never heard it. When they first met, grandfather was instantly impressed. After all, the banker had the same name as his own first son, Michael, who of course carried on the name of his own father, a coincidence which grandfather placed great weight upon. After some small talk, the banker launched into his well-practiced routine of explaining how much money his clients had made out of his bonds. The bonds, he explained, were invested in top 100 listed companies on the New York and London stock exchanges. And because of their judicious spread of investments, were returning his clients at least double what the banks were paying of deposits. He also explained that the Greek drachma was next to worthless, and that gold was rumoured to crash soon. Michael knew his sales pitch very well, having delivered at least 5 times a day for the past decade. Grandfather explained that he was keeping his money in gold sovereigns and was very happy with that. The banker had heard all of this before and quickly went into the next level of his technical explanation of why relying on gold was not smart, even reckless. He ventured that sooner or later the gold standard would be abandoned by the US and that the real wealth would reside in the big American companies. He had expertly honed a 2-level sales pitch. Level 1 was to draw out an initial response, and Level 2 was only used if he thought that the client had money and was a prospect. He rated grandfather as Level 2. Grandfather, being a Feros and not being one to say yes to anything at first, said that he would like to think about this and said that he would catch up on the banker's next quarterly visit. With that, grandfather invited Mihaly to dinner. However, the banker said that he had already arranged his chauffeur to take him back to Kapsale. Needless to say, his car raised a few eyebrows as it left to travel south from Mitata, and tongues at the Kafania were already wagging. On his drive back to his hotel in Kapsale, the banker thought about grandfather. He judged him to be pretty shrewd with his preference for gold sovereigns, something he himself kept his money in. Still, he thought grandfather was worth spending more time on. The banker and grandfather had something in common. They both knew that the Greek drachma was in ruins. It was rumoured that the Greek government would soon dichotomize the drachma, a nice euphemism for destroying the local currency. As it transpired, owners of drachmas were subsequently offered a half in the value, and the other half surrendered to the government in exchange for a 20-year loan paying 5.5% interest. In any event, as a result of World War II, the loans were never ever repaid. This was a disaster for any of the unfortunate Greeks who had decided to stay with their own currency. The gold sovereign, with a nominal value of £1 had been the default currency since 1817. It was a circulating currency accepted not only in Britain, but all over the world. The sovereign contained 0.23454 troy ounces of 22-carat gold, being 91.67% pure gold. In the metric system, the coin weighed 7.98 grams and contained 7.31 pure gold. The banker mused that grandfather would be a challenge to convince him to swap his gold sovereigns for bonds. However, such challenges were what drove Mihaly. The banker had been doing this successfully for over 5 years from his base in Piraeus, and was most confident. Chapter 6. The Banker's Story. Mihaly the banker had a troublesome time since he first managed to sneak into the US through Ellis Island. At the turn of the century, he managed to get through the rigorous immigration barrier with the help of an uncle. He had claimed to be a refugee, homeless, and entirely dependent on his sole surviving relative in the US, and had no papers. He was, however, fit and healthy. Whilst he was only 16, he managed to convince the wary immigration officials that he was 18. He settled down to a hard, early life of working in the markets during the day and learning English at night. He would often walk the streets during the day with a small dictionary and would frequently ask strangers to read out a word to him. To this day, his English had a distinct New Yorker accent, although he tempered this when he moved back to Europe. As his language improved, he took his uncle's advice to get an education, to move up from the lower echelons of working life, and not to end up like him. Mihaly did not like clerical work at first, but he took to numbers and dollars like a duck to water, and in a few years managed to be a reasonable bookkeeper. To supplement his labouring job at the markets, he took on 2 private clients and worked on their books at night. Frankly, he was good at it. At the tender age of 20, he optimistically applied for a job as a bank teller in Astoria, and to his astonishment, he was offered the job. The banking world fascinated him. People would deposit their money, be charged by the bank for having an account, and be further charged for transactions. Too good to be true, he thought. At 23, he became very familiar with the size of remittances being sent back to Europe, and more interestingly, the number of deposits coming to the bank from newly arriving Greeks. They had money. No doubt he would have made manager at the Astoria Bank by 30 by adopting a straight bat and sticking with the core business of banking. However, now in his late 20s, he started mixing with the Wall Street crowd of up-and-coming bankers and enjoyed the social life. Apart from the late nights and womanizing, he was introduced to the world of the stock market. His savvy friends were talking about a new way that small investors could take positions in the market by buying into a product called bonds. A small investor could take on many positions by investing not in the shares themselves, but in an entity that purchased a collection of the same shares. Further still, the bonds could be leveraged by taking on debt, thus increasing the volume of shares held. All this is well known now as the concept of collateralization and leveraging, but at the time somewhat revolutionary. Just before his 30th birthday, he moved from Astoria downtown to New York itself and joined a small group of brokers who specialized in bonds. For 5 years, it was money for jam. However, a couple of deals went bad, and a certain well-connected customer demanded his money back and threatened to go to his friends. There is no need to elaborate. He somehow managed to repay that customer, but he decided it was time to move on, and he decided to try his luck elsewhere. There is a famous Spanish saying that my late brother Jim, also Dimitri, was inclined to quote on his Asian lecture circuits. You go fishing where the fish are. Mihaly, with a good knowledge of how the bond market worked, decided to set up in Piraeus. He had excellent Greek and English and knew how to talk the talk at many levels of society. He had the rare gift, because of his hard upbringing, of being able to connect with hard-working businessmen who had come up through the tough business world. Mihaly knew that some Greeks were doing extraordinarily well. This was the early 1920s, before the Wall Street crash of October 1929, and a perfect time for the start of his European foray. There was no problem for Mihaly to set up a convenient retail bank. It was the moving into private banking and bonds which was the challenge. The real money was in the bonds. In a world where the drachma was being destroyed and the gold sovereigns were the stable currency, how on earth was he going to convince street-smart Greeks with wealth to swap their gold for pieces of paper? Chapter 7. Potassium dichromate. Mihaly had prospects in some far-off places in Greece. He heard rumours from his sources that a family in southern Turkey had made a fortune by selling chromite ore to the Egyptians. The chromite was processed into a suite of chemicals that led to a revolution in colours in the Scottish textile industry. The revolution was in the fact that these new chromium chemicals were not only brilliant new yellow, blue, purple and red colours, but they were mordants. In 1878, two Greek brothers, Antonius and Dimitri, discovered a chromium mineral deposit. The brothers lived in the Ottoman province of Levisi. Levisi is now called Kayakoi. The nearest and best-known modern settlement is Fethiye, a popular tourist destination now for the English. Indulge me in a brief chemistry lesson. Chromite is FeCr2O4 and was not valuable until it could be converted to potassium dichromate. This process was found by Louis Vauquelin, a French chemist. Louis was the first chemist to make potassium dichromate K2CR2O7. This was used as a dye and a mordant for fixing dyes in fabric. Mordants bind the fibers of the material and prevent bleeding and fading of the color. Chromate compounds were first used in 1822 for dyeing fabrics, and the textile industry was a huge user. Later in the 1800s, chemists had been able to make a variety of color compounds like chrome yellow, chrome red, chrome green and emerald green. Chromium compounds with their brilliant new colors revolutionized the textile industry in the 1800s. Was there money in chromium? You bet. Potassium dichromate was selling for 5 shillings a pound in England in 1822. The daily wage then from around 10 pence to 1 shilling a day. The brothers were paid by the Egyptian importers who on-sold to the English. They were paid in sovereigns. Their fortune got dispersed, and the banker Michali thought that this was very prospective. What happened? We don't know, and that is another story to be told one day. Next time you see a bright yellow school bus or fire engine, or the turkey red carpets, think of the chemist Vauquelin and the brothers. This little anecdote was the background of just one of many leads that Mihaly used to follow, and his considerable network were paid very well to locate such gold sovereign collections. Just as an aside, my golfing buddy George Anthony and my wife Chrisse Anthony were the great-grandchildren of these brothers. I'm indebted to George for his historical research. At some stage, the Australian Anthonys shortened their last name to drop off the Hadzi that was at the front of Anthony. However, the living Piraeus descendants still use the full name. Yes, my wife Chrisse Feros was indeed one of the great-grandchildren. Small world indeed. Speaking of colours, a fascinating encounter took place in London in December 1836. Permit me to explain. Chapter 8, December 1836. In December 1836, the distinguished English scientist Michael Faraday, then aged 45, was asked to add to the research on the polychromy of the Parthenon marbles. You don't have to be Greek to understand that this word means many colours. Michael Faraday, FRS, contributed to the study of electromagnetism and electrochemistry. He was formally asked by the committee examining the marbles to explain that chemistry. His 2 letters to the committee are on the record. He didn't mince words. It is well worth reading Joan Connolly's book, The Parthenon Enigma, and I am indebted to Joan for her insights. Faraday was aghast to learn how the Parthenon marbles had been prepared for moulding. They had been prepared by the use of soap lyes and strong acid. Used repeatedly each time a set of moulds was taken, these corrosives removed every bit of colour that might have existed on the original surface of that marble. To be fair, the then Western ideal of beauty, as represented in Greek and Roman statues, was as white, pristine marble. This notion had its origins in the late Renaissance and remained gospel until early 19th century. It was believed correct at the time to have these statues white and pristine. We can presume that the making of moulds was a commercial decision by the museum to monetize their collection. Most major museums in the world have copies of Parthenon sculptures, and they all came from molds. The prevailing approach that they were clean and white fell in very neatly with the desire to make near-perfect molds for copying the original. The museum defended its practices, not just of the mold preparation, but of the custody of the originals. There were admissions of black greasy substances deposited on the sculptures, and that the foulness of the atmosphere had been a result of the miserable air quality of Victorian London. Nevertheless, the museum continued their claim that they were safely housed in Britain. And by corollary, the Greeks couldn't. That doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, the museum continued their claim that they were safely housed in Britain, and by corollary, the Greeks couldn't house them. Being Greek, I freely admit my bias on this issue. In 1931, Joseph Duveen made an enormous donation to house the marbles in a new gallery. Duveen was described as someone who had a particular talent for matching works of art owned by declining European aristocrats with wallets of socially rising American millionaires. A fitting protege of Lord Elgin, the name of the gallery changed from the Elgin Gallery to the Duveen. The practice of regularly cleaning the marbles with hard brushes, chemicals and acids continued until 1938. In 1939, the Daily Mail blew the lid on the museum and printed a sensational story: Elgin marbles damaged in cleaning. Traces of patina had been removed, leaving an unnatural whiteness. You can call the Daily Mail a tabloid catering for the masses, but in this instance, they were on the ball. The predictable response of the museum was to hide the collection away from the prying eyes at the Duveen Gallery location. They spirited away the marbles to an unused section of London Underground. This was most fortuitous because the gallery was badly damaged by the German bombers in 1940. Fast forward to 2018. As a result of earlier conversations with my sister Mary and my brother Victor, I learnt that my maternal grandmother, Anastasia's mother, was buried at the now full Toowong Cemetery in Brisbane in 1963. Her name was Maruli Bernardo. I should have remembered this. However, I had spent 2 decades away from Brisbane and 1 decade tramping the deserts and mountains of the Northern Territory and Western Australia as an exploration geologist focusing on uranium and precious metals, and the 2nd decade practicing my craft as an accountant and tax agent. I might add modestly, successful on both counts. If you visit the ancestral cemetery in Ayia Anastasia in Gethera, you can see a long list of deceased Bernardo family, and the older names are harder and harder to read. Marble does wear away in time, and with acid air pollution, it certainly doesn't need any extra help. One Saturday morning, my sister located the grave in Brisbane. It was in a forlorn state, as were most of the other graves. However, all not lost. Grandmother's headstone was Carrara marble, and the support under the headstone was Helidon sandstone, Australia's premier sandstone. Great choices of stone by my parents at the time, and a tribute to their enormous generosity. The story of how Helidon sandstone was formed and why it is so original in the world, by the way, is well worth following. But I won't try the reader's patience with a lengthy diversion to this story. Carrara marble and Helidon sandstone, wow. All of my Christmases at one time. The grave was in poor condition after 55 years, and I thought of cleaning it myself. I was advised by my monumental stonemason not to use wire brushes or acids or any strong cleaning chemicals on the headstone. I have known of quite a few people who were well-meaning and in the attempt to save money, ruined marbled headstones. I left it to the expert and he did a great job. The only addition was a ceramic encased photo of my grandmother on the headstone. Anyone who has any knowledge of marble would know two things. It is soft, and the calcium carbonate is easily eaten up by acid. The Mohs hardness scale was devised in 1812 by the German mineralogist Friedrich Mohs. Marble is 3 on the scale and a wire brush is 5 to 6. Wire brushes scratch marble. Simple. Diamond's hardness, if you are curious, is 10. Hydrochloric acid was discovered by the alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan around the year 800 AD, and curious humans have been dropping calcium carbonate into acids ever since. The issue of the original colours at the Parthenon was resolved beyond doubt in the 1990s, when the Acropolis Restoration Service, working on the West Colonnade, exposed for the first time in millennia the Parthenon's original rear entry. They found Egyptian blue, red hematite, light greens and orange-brown colours. At the inauguration of the new Parthenon Museum in 2009, the British belatedly issued a press release finally after 200 years. The admission was that there had been polychrome paint on the Elgin marbles. Their expert, with an obvious sense of humour, said that the marbles would have been painted red, white and blue, the colours of the Union Jack. Many must have chucked about the memory loss of their expert in forgetting the green, orange and brown. The Irish and dozens of other countries would not have been pleased. My apologies again about the diversion. Now back to this story. Chapter 9. Grandfather's Sovereigns. Sorry again for that diversion. Hopefully there'll be no more. Back to our story. We can only guess at how much Grandfather was making in a year and how many sovereigns he had collected. Going back in history, the Ottomans did collect taxes from non-Muslims. A poll tax receipt which all non-Muslims had to pay had to be carried at all times. In general, the more remote the location, the less likely was any tax collected. The corollary, however, was that in countries like Albania, the less likely was that any roads or services would be supplied. During the British rule of Kythera and the Ionian Islands, 1809 to 1864, some 1,200 in sterling was described as the annual revenue, and duty was raised on production, land, exports and imports. This is undoubtedly a conservative estimate. We can't be sure of whether Grandfather declared all his assets and income. However, we do know that in the smaller centres bartering was the mainstay of commerce. So it would be doubtful that the authorities would have a good handle of what was being made and what would have been taxed. Kythera had over history had many masters, and the two mentioned, Ottomans and British, are just a few of them. When it comes to taxation, Plato, in 380 BC, was very perceptive, and comments about taxation as Laws X11. Every man ought to have his property valued. The public officers may take a certain portion of the whole value. Alternatively, the tribesmen should bring in a register of yearly produce to the wardens of the county, The public officers may choose to take a certain proportion of the annual revenue. The public officers consider two valuations: property or revenue, whichever on the consideration they deemed the best. The reality, however, in Kitira in those times was that this was a feudal system where very little of the tax revenue was ever spent on the locals. Most of the tax revenue would have ended up with the foreign occupiers and with their few local administrators as a reward for administering the tax system. The other point about taxation in those times was that it was much more difficult for authorities to collect taxes in small villages. It was impossible to collect in the mountains, as the Ottomans found in Albania. It is most unlikely that grandfather would have been very keen to enrich any administration, especially the foreign ones. It was only recently in 1864 that the British rule ended. Grandfather was born only 4 years later in 1868, but would have been very well versed by his own parents as to how the system worked in favour of the administrative class. What we are interested in, and we will never find out, how many sovereigns did grandfather manage to save and collect? Our best guess would be about 200 a year. If the British official estimate in the early 80s that the whole island produced 1,200 sterling a year, you could conservatively multiply that by a factor of 10, and by the early 1920s, Mitata and surrounds probably accounted for 20%, leaving around 24,000. Grandfather, being a successful operator, may well have captured some 10% of that. That's 240 sovereigns a year. Very rubbery figures, we know. Over, say, 20 years, grandfather may well have saved over 4,000 sovereigns. So what is this actually worth? One sovereign contains around 8 grams of gold. 1,000 sovereigns would weigh 8 kilos. That would be around 280 ounces. In 1920 to 1930, the price of gold was worth around US $35 an ounce. So, 1,000 sovereigns would be worth US $9,800, just in gold content. Just to keep the numbers round, we'll count each batch of grandfather's 1,000 sovereigns as being worth US $10,000. We are speculating, but if you were to ask today's Greeks how many gold sovereigns were handed down to each of them by their grandparents, I'd say they would each have received an average of around 10, at least. Our story is that grandfather had amassed a stash of 4,000 sovereigns. That's an eye-watering US $40,000 in the 1920s. If you are curious, 8 kilos of gold today at US $57,000 a kilo would be worth US $456,000 or Australian dollars $610,000. We think that for safety he would have put them in packages of 500 sovereigns, each package weighing 4 kilos. Grandfather would have hidden each of the 8 packages in secure locations and may not have told his wife Maria or anybody else. The National Bank of Greece had established a branch in Hora, at the southern port city on the island in 1905, but grandfather had no interest in using that bank. Interestingly, jumping forward in time, the Bank of Athens set up a branch in Potamos in 1923. Unfortunately, the Anglo-American Bank declared bankruptcy in 1931. Was it the same bank? We don't know. Overall, banking was not a suitable option in Matata in the 1920s. and in any case not trusted by my grandfather. Chapter 10. The Banker's Bonds. The bonds that Mihaly designed were sold as lots with a face value of $100 per lot. He had departed from his former Wall Street colleagues, who preferred to deal in lots starting at $1,000 per lot. He knew that Greeks preferred to start cautiously and wait to see how the bonds were performing. Mihaly gave a guarantee of a minimum cash return of 10% per annum payable quarterly. Each quarter he would have his office prepare a client statement showing the number of bonds purchased, the amount of funds invested, the actual return for the quarter, and the 10% annual return. He would pay at least 10% irrespective of the actual return. He carried a dossier which showed a typical quarterly statement to show potential investors. This dossier had important details in it like the client name, address, their account number, the bonds purchased, the class of bond, their initial cost price, their valuation at the start of the quarter, the end of the quarter, and very prominently displayed the return for that quarter. He then had a confidential report for the past year, showing a summary of all bondholder returns, suitably redacted to not disclose the name of that investor. This showed actual cent returns versus the 10% guaranteed cash return. Nice bar charts rounded out those reports so that even a barely literate investor could see that things were on the up. Michael would take pride in explaining that a minimum guaranteed return of 2.5% was paid without fail in each quarter for the past year. If a prospect asked for a reference from an existing investor, Mihaly would provide a short list and say, "You pick one. I'll get him to telegram you." All of this was practiced from his Wall Street experience a decade before. Quite a clever way to appear to gain confidence. The bonds themselves were a work of art and mirrored the formality of the English and US bonds. With a nice historical touch, the drawing of the bank's exterior featured a copy of the Parthenon Eastern frieze. Along with the Eastern frieze, there was the centerpiece of Zeus and Athena. A small world indeed, a subliminal message maybe. In addition to his sales kit, he would leave potential clients with a nicely constructed graphical representation of the US stock market index, the top 100 listed companies for the period 1900 to 1920. He also had a representation of which companies had made the top 100 in the past year. Mihaly's premium bond was only constructed with the top 100 companies. He had no other bond for sale to investors. His pitch was strength, security, and trust. Michael had made some interesting modifications which grandfather would learn about later. Chapter 11. The deal was done. Some months passed after the banker's visit. Demetrios did peruse the material left with him and was lukewarm. However, he thought it may be partly worth a punt. Frankly, he had nobody to confide in, and he had always kept his own counsel. Furthermore, most of his now adult children had settled in Australia and appeared to be doing well. One had gone to America, and as an aside, it is rumoured that he helped banker Mihaly get started. We will never know. Demetrios mulled over his options. He had 4,000 gold sovereigns and did want to invest in a wonderful parcel of land in Piraeus. That would have taken up about 3/4 of his savings. He wondered if he should invest the remaining quarter. He hoped that remaining quarter would perform as promised. There was a buyback guarantee if the bonds were kept for at least 12 months. This extra piece of good news was telegraphed to him by Mihaly the banker, who had announced that he would be in Mitata the middle of next month. Mihaly duly arrived again by chauffeur and greeted Dmitri like an old friend. The chauffeur curiously wore a white suit with a red fez. He was not hard to miss. Business had been great in the bond market, and Mihaly produced a fresh set of quarterly returns, plus the written buyback guarantee, subject to the 12-month ownership condition. Things were looking good, and Dmitri said that he would be prepared to start with an investment of 500 gold sovereigns. Mihaly was upbeat. He had just signed up a new investor in Potamos for 1,000 gold sovereigns and was very happy so far with his day on Kethera. He was always preoccupied with his clients and leads in Smyrna, but still enjoyed the challenge of dealing with people in the smaller islands. Frankly, these people were quite savvy, and he felt that they were keeping him young. The real money was in Smyrna, in Turkey. A particular man that he wanted to get to see was Aristotle, but with the extraordinary events set to unfold, we will never know whether he had any success. Maybe the distant uncle who helped him get started may have told him about his own father Dmitri in Mitata at some stage. Again, we would never know. Chapter 12. 9th of September, 1922, Smyrna. The captain of the Kilkis was very apprehensive. His battleship had been here before on May the 15th, 1919, to land troops and supplies for the invasion of Turkey. How things can change, mused the captain. The Greek army had abandoned Smyrna on the 8th of September 1922 and left the civilian population to the fate of the Turkish army. The Greek battleships Kilkis and Lemnos were ordered to depart Smyrna on the evening of the 8th of September 1922. The Allies had 21 warships standing off Smyrna harbour and appeared to be under orders not to interfere. This was a formidable force, comprising HMS Iron Duke and King George V, the USS Litchfield, Simpson, Lawrence and Edsel, 5 French naval vessels and 2 Italian. The Greek navy was in a major quandary. There was real fear that Turkey would soon invade Greece, and that because Turkey had no navy, the Greek warships would be a tempting prize. The catastrophe that befell Smyrna is still being analysed today. However, in brief, from the 13th to the 22nd, fires destroyed that city. The quay on the harbour was crammed with desperate Armenians and Greeks. Turkish troops had cordoned off the quay and prevented anyone from leaving the area. According to some reports, 6 vessels, dubbed the Ships of Mercy, attempted the first evacuation on Thursday, the 14th of September 1922. These were 1 American, 1 Japanese, 2 French, and 2 Italian. Some Greek Navy vessels under escort from 6 US Navy ships also entered the harbour, the protection being necessary to prevent them from falling into Turkish hands. About 150,000 to 200,000 were believed to have escaped, whilst over 30,000 are said to have perished, an episode of Dunkirk proportions. Certainly, Aristotle escaped. But our interest is in this story about one Greek seaman from the Kilkis and how he came across two men stranded on that quay. Chapter 13. The First 500 Sovereigns. Once the handshake deal of banker Mihaly was done, on his second visit to Mitata, the paperwork and handover of the sovereigns followed the well-practiced routine. The bonds were drawn, suitably embossed and sealed, and delivered to grandfather by the chauffeur. There were two sets of the bonds drawn up, one for the customer and one for the bank, and both had to be signed and witnessed by a notary public. Mitata had one notary public, and as part of the deal, the bank paid for the witnessing of the two sets. Once the paperwork was signed and witnessed, the sovereigns were handed over to the chauffeur. We digress here to explain that grandfather commented later that this fellow seemed to be quite educated and knowledgeable. He looked like he had come from a Central African country, and to be fair, grandfather may not have understood that some of the Afro-Americans in the US had received very good educations and worked in places such as banks. Notably, the man seemed very assured, heavily built, but very light on his feet. In short, someone who could handle himself in a tight situation. Chapter 14. The next 1,500 sovereigns. Grandfather was quite at ease. At the end of the first quarter, he received a statement from the bank showing his credit of 2.5% and an increased balance on his bond account. He was offered the credit as cash, but there was a recommendation from the bank that the earnings far exceeded the bank's term deposit rate. Grandfather let it ride, like the vast majority of other investors. The same quarterly routine followed for the next 2 quarters. So far, so good. Grandfather knew he had 4,000 sovereigns, but had figured that his next target would be to invest a further 1,500 sovereigns. So his total in bonds would be 2,000 sovereigns. The other 2,000 would be earmarked for a parcel of land in Piraeus. He had been keeping his eye on that land. Grandfather thought 2,000 in bonds and 2,000 in land was a suitable spread of risk. Spreading risk, by the way, is not a 20th century concept invented by planners. It has been around for millennia. Chapter 15. Grandfather goes to Piraeus. It was necessary for grandfather to take the long trip to Piraeus, as he had heard a rumour that someone else was interested in the land he had been considering. Normally, he would only go once a year, as he liked to stay close to his interests in Mitata, and was not really a big city person. Once in Piraeus, and having found that the property was still on the market, he thought it would be a good idea to visit Mihaly at that bank. Rather than arrive unannounced, he sent a telegram asking to call by. He received a polite reply from the bank saying that Mihaly was away in Smyrna, but that his assistant would look after him the following morning at 10 a.m. He was to report to the reception at the ground level first. The security guard checked him through, having entered his name on the visitor log. He was escorted up to the second floor reception by lift and again logged in by security. It was explained that access to the second and third floors was restricted to the bank's valued clients and the bank's administration. A smartly dressed assistant manager met Grandfather and apologised profusely that Mihaly was away. Grandfather explained that this was just a courtesy call and that he was very happy with his dealings with the bank. After the obligatory Greek coffee and sweets, and much small talk, Grandfather left at 10:30 a.m. thinking that they had a pretty good setup at that bank. The ground level was a traditional retail bank. The second floor was for valued clients, which he was now certain that he was. The third floor was for administration, all of which made perfect sense. He didn't ask about the third floor, but the assistant manager did confirm that there were just administrative people up there. Grandfather did notice that the lift buttons on the fourth and fifth floors were covered over and certainly not available to anyone who might have gone into the lift without security. In any case, it was not even possible to enter the lift from the ground floor without a security guard. On the ferry back to Hora, Grandfather felt good. The land was still available and his bank was solid. So far so good, he thought. Chapter 16, June 1922. Grandfather was very upbeat about his prospects, as he was frequently inclined to do. After a long day in the business, he would reflect on where he was in the world. The mill was running well, and all his customers were paying on time. He was also collecting more sovereigns. His large family was starting to be hard to follow. In brief, 4 of his sons were starting to make their way into Australia: Tony, John, Peter, and George. John had made his way to Australia, having spent some time in the US beforehand. They had settled in northern New South Wales, and from all reports, knew that they were doing well. Mihaly was showing great promise in taking care of the family properties and the family businesses, and was destined to stay in Mitata. His daughters Girani and Erini were married and had already started families. Nicholas, who is my father, was still in Greece, and at the tender age of 21 was halfway through his military service in the Greek Navy. On the investment front, Grandfather mused that his land purchase was going to plan, and he had now sufficient sovereigns remaining to settle. Frankly, he was holding off for a better deal, as the owner appeared to be getting into difficulty. Instead of 2,000 sovereigns, he may be able to get it for only 1,500 sovereigns. On the bonds, he was most pleased. He had already made his promised 2.5% for the first 2 quarters, building his stake from 500 sovereigns to the equivalent of 525 sovereigns. Not bad for doing nothing, he thought. Maybe it was time to commit the further 1,500 sovereigns to build his stake to 2,000 as originally planned. In early June 1922, Grandfather received bad news. The owner of the land in Piraeus sold to a different investor and had not bothered to forewarn grandfather. Very strange. However, Mihaly had not entered into any contract, despite being advised by his solicitor in Potamos. Grandfather, after all, thought that the price was going down and did not wish to appear to be too desperate. What to do? In some ways, he missed the boys that had left for Australia. They were astute even from a young age, and in any case, may have seen the writing on the wall for both Kythera and Greece itself. Grandfather deep down took his own counsel and backed his own judgment. It had certainly worked, up until now. Chapter 17, August 1922. Almost inevitably, Grandfather was leaning back to completing his investment on the bonds. He had earmarked 2,000 sovereigns and had 1,500 sovereigns to complete that plan. He sent a telegram to the banker and received an immediate reply that Mihaly the banker, out of station, was that the East India Company had started so many years ago. But not to worry, Mihaly would be in touch. A reply did come the next day from the assistant manager that Mihaly may be able to squeeze in a visit in very late August. However, there was a thinly veiled question. Was this to complete the bond purchase? Grandfather, contrary to the way he had always conducted his affairs with discretion, said that he was committing a further 1,500 sovereigns. The banker and his ever-present chauffeur duly arrived, and the paperwork was completed. Again, the notary public witnessed the documents, and Grandfather found to his relief that the fee for witnessing the bonds was settled by the bank. Grandfather found that the banker was quite preoccupied and out of character, dispensed with a lot of small talk. He said they were rushing to Agia Belagia to connect with the very last ferry and then for very urgent affairs in Smyrna. The deal was done, and the banker and chauffeur sped off to Agia Belagia. It was the 31st of August, and ominously for Grandfather, 24 days before the holy day of Our Lady of the Myrtles, which was held on the 24th of September every year, and the year now was 1922. All Kytherians know the story of the loss of the Myrthiotissa and its recovery from under the myrtle trees. The events invoke both fear and relief in Kytherians, fear of the loss and joy in the recovery. Frankly, Grandfather lost his composure in the afternoon and had an epiphany that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Without any thought, he grabbed his remaining 2,000 sovereigns from their hiding places. He had bound them in 4 lots of 500, and he raced to the east to intercept the banker. He caught them just before they boarded the 6 p.m. ferry, and this was not an easy task. The roads were not good. However, his horse and buggy were up to the task. Quite incredibly, he did catch the banker just before boarding. The actual events of the handover must have mystified the banker, but he was sufficiently shrewd to accept the sovereigns, with a solemn promise that the notary public would receive all the documents by the end of the week. The banker apologised profusely that he could not interrupt his plans, as he had to urgently visit Smyrna. Nevertheless, the banker for the second time assured grandfather that all was well. He gave grandfather a box of fine cigars as a gift. In passing, grandfather noticed a curious thing. The tan leather briefcase with the miniature English and United States flags on either side of the central lock was now secured to the chauffeur's right arm by a heavy-duty chain. Chapter 18, September 1922, Smyrna. The captain of the Kilkis was very apprehensive. In 25 years of service, he had never seen such a dreadful scene. His superiors had already ordered his departure from the harbour on the evening of the 8th of September 1922. He had been told that he was forbidden to re-enter. The Kilkis was a battleship, formerly the USS Mississippi BB-23. It was large, 13,000 tons, with a length of 166 metres and a beam of 23 metres. Belatedly, the Allied powers agreed to an American request for 6 US Navy vessels to escort some Greek ships into the harbour to rescue civilians. The Kilkis was not officially with the rescue flotilla. It was an important battleship that, along with the Lemnos and the Avarov, were vital for the defence of the Greek islands and the mainland. The captain was undoubtedly going through the most trying time of his long and distinguished career. The Navy seemed to be in complete disarray with news that the Army had abandoned the civilians to their fate. There were important political changes going on that he was not aware of. However, he wanted to do something to help rescue civilians from the Smyrna harbour. The Kilkis released 2 landing craft vessels that could be used in shallower waters and were equipped with cranes for loading and unloading. Perfect for delivering troops and supplies onto an enemy beach. Equally perfect for the rescue mission. The scene was utter chaos. Massive fires were destroying the harbour installations, and Turkish soldiers had barricaded civilians into that burning wharf precinct. To make matters worse, explosions were tearing up the buildings. It was rumoured that munitions were stored in the civilian part of the harbour. We will never know. In any case, the place was a tinderbox of wooden buildings and wharves, and with all the munitions was a catastrophe waiting to happen. There was no escape for the thousands trapped on that wharf. They could not cross the barbed wire barriers set up by the Turks, and the machine gun posts and snipers were set to lock them in. The ships of mercy started the almost impossible task of saving civilians. When the main walkways of the wharves were either blown up or burning to the waterline, the only possible pickup points were parts of the wharf still standing, to enable the cargo nets to be lowered as close as possible to the remnants of the wharf. It was dangerous and calamitous. But by miracle, thousands of men, women and children were saved. The Kilkis landing craft waited for their turn to approach to a section of the wharf structure where cargo nets could still be used. There was no other way. Certainly they couldn't go any nearer. It would just compound the dreadful situation. The sea waters were on fire with burning oil slicks. A gruesome sight with dead and dying civilians caught in the waters of the harbour. A young sailor from the Kilkiss on the first craft lowered a cargo net as close as possible to a surviving wharf structure. There was not much of that wharf left. This sailor and the others manning the two craft were all volunteers. The captain had truthfully explained to the sailors that this was a dangerous mission. If the smoke was not that bad, the young sailor may have seen a heavily built, dark man in a white suit. Just behind him was another man in very formal business attire, but he did not see either of them. At the moment the cargo net was lowered, a huge explosion racked the wharf, and unfortunately at least 200 people perished. Quite incredibly, when the net was pulled aboard, there were 5 women and children huddled in the net. No men. But what caught the young sailor's eye was a tan leather briefcase, monogrammed and with an English and United States flag on either side of the central lock. There were remnants of a chain on the handle. Rescue complete as it ever could be, the two craft made it back to the flotilla and eventually back to the Kilkiss. With the urgent need to take survivors to the medical rooms on the vessel, the sailor put the case amongst his things on his bunk, not taking any interest in it. In any event, it was badly oil-stained, burnt, and frankly looked like junk. It was indeed a miracle that that case had survived. Chapter 19, October 1922, Piraeus. The Kilkiss finally made it back to home port after a very difficult 3 weeks sailing. There were refugees to be unloaded at processing centres and hospitals, other refugees to move around, and a defensive station in case the Turks mounted any attacks. They had been at sea for 6 months without a break. Sadly, as a postscript, the Kilkiss did meet its fate, sunk by a German Stukas in April 1941 in the naval depot of Salamis. Our brave captain had retired well before then. Sailors were given a well-deserved shore break of 2 weeks. Rumours were widespread that the Greek Navy was going to be a part of a counter-attack. This came to the attention of the young seaman who participated in the Smyrna rescue mission. He was warned by a close relative not to go back to the ship. It would be a death sentence, he was told. He thought, I'd better make plans to join my brothers in Australia. He also had a favourite cousin on the Kilkiss, Peter, who was also told to make himself scarce. Meanwhile, the young seaman was finally able to go through his things, and he came across the valise that he'd accidentally picked up. He had forgotten about it, and frankly was a bit wary of opening it, given its terrible condition and the circumstances he came across it. To his astonishment, there were bank documents and 7 cloth bags of sovereigns. Even more astonishing, the bank deposits showed receipts and ledgers. He recognized that 3 of the receipts were made out to Chrisse Feros of Mitata. That sailor was Nicholas Feros, one of the sons of Dmitri. and incidentally, that sailor was my father. His cousin Peter also left for Australia, and they were to become lifelong friends in their new country. With the imperative of absolute haste to leave the country on a ship departing the next day for the Suez, he confided in a close relative and asked him to explain to his father. Sadly, Nicholas did not have time to go back to Kythera before leaving. Chapter 20, December 1922, Mitata. To grandfather's relief, he heard that his son Nicholas was alive and well and had survived the evacuation of Smyrna. The news that he had taken off for Australia was kept under wraps because the authorities had already made inquiries of the family in Mitata as to where Chrisse Feros was. Grandfather had told the authorities that he had no idea where his son was, and that was the truth at the time. Just before Christmas, the battered suitcase arrived at grandfather's house through a close relative. It was immediately obvious that the bank ledger faithfully had recorded the 3 lots of investments. There were the very first 250 sovereigns, the additional 1,750 sovereigns, and the final 2,000. It goes without saying, read the discovery of separate packets of sovereigns. There were 8, with 500 in each packet, totaling 4,000 sovereigns. It was an immense relief. The good Lord had smiled on Dmitri. His sovereigns had come back to him. On reflection, Dmitri stopped to think about why the bank had been only paid 3 lots of dividends. They had stopped in September 22. At least the paperwork had stopped. This was all very troubling for Dmitri, and despite the great luck in recovering his money, he resolved to go and pay the bank a visit. He was more than a little curious. I am reminded of another saying of my oldest brother, Cosma, the twin of Dmitri, James, who coined the Spanish saying of, "Go fishing where the fish are." Cosma would say that when a man with money deals with a man with experience, then the outcome is inevitably that the man with the money comes away with the experience. And, you guessed it, the man with the experience comes away with the money. Grandfather would not have been the first to come up with the experience, and sadly won't be the last. Nevertheless, in December 1922, grandfather was on the case, pardon the pun, and was determined to check it out. Chapter 21, March 1923, back to the bank. The bank was still there, with the downstairs security guard on station. As on his last visit, the assistant manager went through the pleasant routine of explaining that his banker Michali was out of station, but significantly did not mention Smyrna. He may not have known where he was or what had befallen him on that wharf. After finishing his Greek coffee on the 2nd floor, the meeting being over, Dmitri this time noticed that the 4th and 5th floor buttons on the lift were deliberately still covered over. He could not do anything at the time, as the lift driver, accompanied by a second security guard, were stationed at the lift controls. Grandfather had 2 close school friends who had made their way up in the police force. The police inspector had heard some strange rumours about this banker and his chauffeur. The stories were not pleasant. They had the whiff of bad news about them. The banking regulator had also heard stories, but for reasons best known to themselves, took no action on numerous customer complaints. The inspector also had no time for these foreign bankers and was in the mood to check this out for himself. He had been rebuffed twice already by his superior to investigate. Together with 2 heavily armed constables, they decided to pay the bank another visit. This time, no pleasantries. The security guard was ordered to take them to the 4th floor immediately. There was also no obligatory protest by the assistant manager. He shrewdly figured that this was no time to be stalling by asking for a search authority. The menacing presence of grandfather, 2 constables with shotguns, and 2 senior officers put paid to any stalling or even the chance of warning the 4th floor. The lift driver, rather sheepishly, drew aside the covers to the upper lift floors, and in fact was rather glad that the charade was going to be over. He never liked the people on the 4th floor. They were very arrogant. The police smashed through the 4th floor security door. There was some surprise and bewilderment at the scene that unfolded through the drawn curtains and dim lights. There were 6 staff, none dressed in the standard bank uniforms. They looked more like printing press operators, which they were. A very modern German printing press was churning out bond documents. Another group of accountants were busy in a side room preparing client ledgers. These hand-drafted ledgers were in turn printed by a second printing press. Grandfather and the police figured out what was going on. Chapter 22, June 1923. Piecing it together. The bonds were fake and total fabrication. There were no investments in any of the top 100 United States companies or any other companies. There never were, there never would be. The regular payments were part of a modified Ponzi scheme. Carlo Ponzi was born in 1882 in the beautiful town of Lugo in northern Italy. Our banker had met Carlo in New York in the early 1920s, and the two mixed regularly with the Wall Street crowd. As history shows, Carlo developed a scam whereby investors were promised a 50% return if they held discounted postal reply coupons for 45 days before redeeming at face value. The return was 100% if they held for 90 days. The early investors were paid by monies collected by the next round of investors. A most clever ruse. Carlo will be forever remembered for the wrong reasons. Poor Carlo lived to the gold old age of 66 years old in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but not before he did some jail time. About 14 years, in fact, in and out of jail, before being deported back to Italy. Our banker figured out a clever variation to Ponzi schemes. Sadly, whilst Ponzi lived to write his own autobiography, our banker perished on the wharf in Smyrna. He never got to write his own book. It may have made a great read. The banker's descendants could probably write his story. Wishful thinking. These are the sort of people that have to keep looking over their shoulder. This reminds me of my own saying, in your life, it is best to tell the truth, because you won't have to remember what lies you have already told. Bond investors always received their 2.5% quarterly dividends. However, these were just fake book entries drawn up by the accountants working on that fourth floor. Imagine, not even the dividends were real. They were just paper entries on a customer ledger. Banker Dimitri had a beautifully constructed scam. In short, it was sovereigns for pieces of paper, and the culmination of decades of planning. The only reason that it came to an abrupt end was that the banker and his chauffeur met their maker on the wharves of Smyrna. They had planned to wrap up operations by mid-1923, having heard that their friend Carlo was in jail. However, greed got the better of them. It usually does. The banker couldn't believe his luck in convincing the Greeks they should part with their sovereigns for pieces of paper. He also thought it would go on forever. It never does. It's interesting. New Ponzi schemes continue to this day. A legacy of Carlo and, of course, the greed of investors. Sadly, I never met Grandfather. I have attributed a few quotes in this story, so it's opportune that we hear one from Grandfather. After his uncovering of the scam, I'm sure he would have said something like this. When a fraudster is talking to you face to face, he's lying to you. When he's not talking to you, he is stealing from you. Chapter 23. The Gift. There is a small plaque in the church at Potamos and a Lariotissa, a smiling Madonna, with an inscription that this was a gift to the church from the Anglo-American branch. You can still see it to this day. There was a rumour that Grandfather found an additional package of sovereigns in the remains of that briefcase 5 years after he opened it. It was said to be fused into the linings and only came to light when he took the briefcase to pieces, looking to recycle some of that leather. Just a rumour? Maybe Mother's Mantinada would tell us if we could hear it. Chapter 24. Moving forward, August 2014, the Mitata Wine Festival. On the night of the 2014 Mitata Wine Festival, the Cretan band was in full flight, and the dancers resplendent in their traditional costumes. The food was extraordinarily beautiful, especially for the tourists, most of whom this year have come in from Australia and had deep family connections with the island. The festival was held on the 9th of August, 2014. I was fortunate to have my brother Harry as my guide. We had spent the day visiting his home at Carava and looking at Mitata, looking at Potamos, and spending time in Agia Anastasia. Brother Harry is our family historian and has given me many insights as to the background for the story that I have written. Needless to say, our tale would not have been written without Harry's knowledge and inspiration. As we entered the festival, Harry introduced me very briefly to a man, and he said, "John Feros, meet John Feros." It was like looking into a mirror. The poor fellow looked just like me. Ha, I thought. Actually, he was my age and very distinguished looking. There are 5 giant 300-litre barrels of wine on offer. The Feros offering at barrel number 2 is a Grenache with a fruity flavour, light on the palate, but with a fair nose and a little body, but not much. There is no finish, something that leads the queue to barrel number 2, rather forlorn. The visitors are lining up at the better-known white wine. The Feros wine, however, is earthy and a sentimental favourite. Sitting some distance in a poorer lit area away from the Feros descendants from Australia, who it must be said were enthusiastically supporting barrel number 2, were a middle-aged couple. They were somewhat overdressed and not entering into the spirit of things, and frankly looked a little uneasy. Below the sweet sounds of the Cretan music with the haunting clarino, they may have heard an accompanying mantinada with a tale from the 1920s. Who knows? The isolated couple were not enjoying the festival? Or didn't understand it, maybe. We will never know who these people were, but the story the next morning in the village was that they were from New York and had stopped by from Switzerland. This is something they did here. They had also travelled in style with a chauffeur-driven Mercedes 450L. Could it be? The gossip was that they were cryptocurrency experts and that their clients were making fortunes. Ironic that their own grandfather had an interest in coins, but real solid ones, not today's fake bitcoins. Financial commentators far smarter than me describe cryptocurrency as perhaps just another Ponzi scheme. You may know that Americans are not required under the United States Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act to declare gold stored outside of financial institutions. The Swiss are canny bankers and have driven a bus through the loophole being outside financial institution. Americans can keep their gold valuables in storage, and it is not reportable. Unbelievable. The Swiss have converted former military bankers for this very purpose, and there is no shortage of customers. If you think about it, why would anyone salt away their valuables in a remote bunker in Switzerland? Surely they would be proud to have them close by to admire them. Just maybe, heaven forbid, the owners are not quite ready to admit where their valuables actually came from. The locals in Mitata believe that the quiet visitors make an annual pilgrimage to check on their gold sovereign safe storage. Just a rumour. If there was a modern-day mantinada and our mother Anastasia was still with us, there would have been another great verse to sing. Chapter 25. The Gods Are Watching. Zeus, from his Mount Olympus, certainly knew all the visitors at that wine festival. He liked the Greeks from Australia. They had a charm about them. He also knew of the ancient and timeless gods of their continent. He joked with Poseidon that the pandemic meant that travel to Australia was disrupted, and that he missed seeing the spirits of the First Nations people. There was good-natured banter between the gods and the spirits as to who was there first. Zeus often confided in his good friend Poseidon that the missing friezes of the Parthenon and the gold sovereigns would someday be returned to their rightful owners. He knew exactly where they all were now and who took them. To this day, both items are staying put. In 2009, at the inauguration of the new Parthenon Museum, the British belatedly issued a press release finally after 200 years, admitting that there was polychrome paint on the Elgin marbles. However, they still hold the sculptures, and for many around the world, this is unfinished business. At least after 2 centuries, the notion of their safe custody and proper scientific study has been somewhat tarnished. As for the gold sovereigns, a different story. There is a little problem for the current owners of these sovereigns. They can look all they want, but they can't take them away. The Swiss storage vaults are full and draw many visitors. I would imagine that it would not be difficult for authorities to record and track visitors and monitor their communications. Apart from surveillance, there are all sorts of double tax agreements now, and privacy is not what it used to be. It is getting tough out there to hide things. Spare a thought, though, for the scammers. Good luck to anyone trying to smuggle back more than just a few sovereigns. We can thank modern airport technology and disclosures, such as the Panama and Pandora Papers, to identify the participants. In any case, the main thing is that Zeus is watching. Maybe these ill-gotten sovereigns will never come back. One thing is for certain, Grandfather lived up to the ideals of Plato, who wrote that the mark of a good citizen is someone who tells the truth and pays their debt. Grandfather's descendants made their way to success in Australia. They have also not forgotten their roots. They have made much more than the original sovereigns, and really would not be distressed by their loss. As my brother Cosma would joke, it's not the money, it's the principle of the money. The banker's descendants, whoever and wherever they are, continue to live in their shadow and maintain their silence. They must. They are the antithesis of Plato's good citizen. They are wealthy and have a lot of gold sovereigns, but can do no more than just look at them once a year. They also dare not tell anyone. They also have to keep looking over their shoulder and pray that no one's going to knock on the door with a warrant. Yes, and Zeus is watching. Mother's Mandinatha echoes in our minds. Today's Carlo Ponzis continue the legacy of fraud. There is no shortage of customers, especially with the current craze of cryptocurrency, which is just another Ponzi scheme. More Mandinathas should be composed and performed. Chapter 26, November 2021. On Saturday, the 13th of November 2021, the 3-day meeting for the Acropolis Restoration Project wound up. This was the 7th international meeting for the restoration of the Acropolis monuments. The 3-day meeting focused on repairs and restorations currently taking place at the old Acropolis Museum. 2 scientists had struck up a friendship and were comparing notes at dusk. It was a glorious sunset and a fitting end to a fascinating set of papers delivered. One had delivered a paper on the significance of use of XRF, X-ray fluorescence, to pick up non-visible paint residue on the marble sculptures. The other scientist had recognized the great importance of first laser cleaning then using XRF on the unusual amount of quartz grains in the Pentelicon marble, a feature known by Pericles as it gave marble a brilliance in the sunlight. The two reached the same conclusion, independently, that laser cleaning followed by XRF on the quartz grains could unlock the hitherto invisible colours, something that others had missed. They were so engaged in the science that they had barely time to introduce themselves. After an ouzo and Mercedes, the scientists, James and Maria, were enjoying an ouzo and Mercedes. James told Maria that he had studied in the UK, but modestly did not mention that he was soon to be admitted as a fellow at the Royal Society. Maria told him that she had obtained her doctorate at the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki and was born in Germany of Greek parents. Maria rather shyly said that a few of her colleagues were off to Kythera the next day, and would he like to spend the weekend there before leaving for London. She said that she wanted to study the middens of Lemonas Beach, and that she thought there was some family connection. She wanted to do some strontium isotope dating to see how old these middens were. James agreed to go and blushed. He was quite taken by Maria's intellect and her beautiful Greek features. There was a mutual attraction. To finalize the travel arrangements, they exchanged their full names. You may have guessed by now, but the travellers to Kythera that next day were Mr. Faraday and Miss Feropoulos. A small world indeed. What Maria would not have known was that a few days later, on the 16th of November 2021, the PNAS accepted a paper by Turkish and international scientists in which they presented evidence of the remains of a young man aged about 18 to be a victim of the Thera tsunami. The location was Çeşme. This is a very small world indeed. The beautiful beaches and shoreline of Çeşme were where Chrissy's grandparents and families lived happily until September 1922. Some, fortunately, survived. A very small world indeed. Zeus playfully hit Poseidon on the arm, and Poseidon thought, "Here we go again, with the troublesome Zeus quoting his favourite actor." Zeus was a movie buff. It was the final line in Casablanca where Humphrey Bogart is escaping Vichy France with his former antagonist police chief. Lewis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I hope very much that you have enjoyed this tale. Written by John Nicholas Feros.